Good afternoon, each and every one of you. Thank you ever so much for being with us this afternoon. My name is Hank Clark. I'm the program director of the Political Economy Project, and it really is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the PEP's fourth public event of spring term. Do check out our website, pep.dartmouth.edu, for the full lineup of forthcoming events. We are very fortunate indeed to have as our speaker today Benjamin M. Friedman, the William Joseph Meyer Professor of Political Economy at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1972. Ben is, as many of you know, one of our most respected and influential economists, and one who's had the rare ability to reach the full range of audiences, from professional economists to policymakers to the general public, writing on monetary, financial, and banking policy, among many, many other topics. Ben is the author of some 17 books, by my count, and over 150 professional journal articles. For my own taste, his 2005 book, The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, is one of those classics that we would all do well to revisit every few years or so. Today, he is here, as you know, to discuss with us his big, ambitious new book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Already widely and respectfully reviewed, the book offers a fundamental reassessment of the religious origins and continuing religious influence on especially American political economy. And so it's a real joy to have him with us. Now, the format for today's event, like most PEP events, will be very simple. Ben will speak for a while. And if you have questions as he goes along, if you would please use either the chat function or the raise hands function at the bottom of your monitor. We will get to as many questions as we can. I'll try and call on a few students to begin, but everyone present is welcome to participate, and we'll take as many questions as we have time for. So without further ado, Ben, thanks so very much for being with us this snowy afternoon in New Hampshire. The floor is all yours. Take it away, sir.
Thank you, Hank, for that very generous introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. I'm honored to be able to speak in this program. I have some slides, which I will see if I can put up by sharing my screen. Okay. Hank, maybe you can tell me, did I do that successfully? Are the slides there?
Yes, they are indeed.
Great, thank you. Well, it's an honor to be here. As Hank mentioned, my new book is called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And the central question that I undertake in this book is to explore where our modern Western economics came from. I want to re-examine where modern Western economics emerged and why it happened then as opposed to someplace else, or some century before, or some century later. And let me be very specific about what I have in mind. I'm going to be interested in the proposition that economists typically call the first fundamental welfare theorem. It's the idea that individuals acting in nothing more than their own self-interest in the economic sphere can, and under the right circumstances will, end up making other people better off. Now, at least among economists, we pretty much take this idea for granted. It's so familiar to us. But if you pause and think about it for a moment, and especially if you put it against the background of a few thousand years of thinking about the role of self-interest in society, this is a very deep and startling idea. So asking where it comes from, I think, is very appropriate. Now, there are two presumptions about what are the right answer to this question. The first one is to point to Adam Smith and his great book of 1776, The Wealth of Nations. Donald Winch, alas, no longer with us, but surely the foremost Adam Smith scholar of our lifetimes, pointed to Smith's Wealth of Nations as the fountainhead, as he called it, of classical political economy. And then the second presumption, following from the first, is that because Adam Smith and David Hume and the other great figures of that time were part of the Scottish Enlightenment, and we think of the Enlightenment as in part a movement away from conceptions of a God-centered universe toward what in our modern vocabulary we would call secular humanism, it therefore follows that modern economics is likewise nothing to do with religion, much to the contrary. Nick Phillipson, also alas no longer with us, who wrote what I think is the best biography of Adam Smith from the perspective of gaining an insight into Smith's work, referred not just to the Wealth of Nations, but Smith's entire intellectual project as, in his words, built on the foundations of the Enlightenment's quintessential assault on religion. And I don't think Nick was thought he was saying anything new. He was just giving voice to the standard presumption. Well, I'm going to accept the first presumption, as I'll make clear as I go along. I do consider Adam Smith the father of my subject, but I'm going to reject quite frontally the second of these two presumptions. Instead, my central argument is that a large part of what gave rise to the new thinking that Adam Smith and his contemporaries gave us was a new line of thought within the English-speaking Protestant world at their day, namely the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism. And I'm going to argue that this turn away from belief in predestination opened up the space for a new and much more optimistic and expansive view of the possibilities for human choice, human action, human agency. Now, let me clear up right at the beginning one potential misunderstanding. I am not suggesting that any of this had to do with the actions of religiously committed individuals self-consciously trying to bring their religious beliefs to bear on their professional work. People like Adam Smith and David Hume were international celebrities within their own lifetimes. As a result, we know a lot about them biographically, and it just wouldn't be right to make such an assumption. David Hume, in particular, was a notorious opponent of any kind of organized religion. He used to refer to Church of England bishops as retainers to superstition. Many people, me included, read his works to indicate that he's at the very least an agnostic, more likely an atheist. His great friend, William Robertson, who was at the time the head of the Church of Scotland, referred to him as a heathen. Adam Smith was much more circumspect and private about his personal religious beliefs, but there's no evidence whatsoever to lead us to think that Smith was a religiously committed man. If anything, he was something of an 18th century deist, along the lines that we in America would associate from that day with, for example, Thomas Jefferson or, say, Benjamin Franklin. Well, if that wasn't the story, what was it? I draw in the book heavily on Albert Einstein's notion of the world view, Bild der Welt, in Einstein's original German. Einstein famously stated that scientific thought is a development of pre-scientific thought. And he elaborated the idea in this way. You can read it for yourself. The idea is that the world as it exists is just too complex a place. And therefore, if we try to analyze the world as it exists, we're never going to make any progress. And therefore, Einstein thought that each of us carries around in our mind what he called a simplified image of the world built, developed. And as a result, when we do our analysis or our thinking, we address not the world as it exists in all of its complexity, but that image of the world. We economists would call it a model. And Einstein, importantly, pointed not just to physical scientists, but he pointed to painters, as you can see, to poets, to philosophers. Philosophers is important in this context because Adam Smith wasn't an economist. The word didn't exist then. Smith was a professor of moral philosophy. Well, am I on firm ground in applying this Einstein concept to economists? Several of my predecessors in my department at Harvard certainly thought so. Joseph Schumpeter wrote that when any economist sits down to do his or her analysis, the person has in mind what Schumpeter called a pre-analytic vision. And incidentally, that capital V on vision is not mine, that's Schumpeter's, and it's more or less what Einstein had in mind as the worldview. My late and dearly missed friend, Ken Galbraith, wrote that economic ideas are always and intimately a product of their own time and place. Well, I'm going to argue that Adam Smith's and David Hume's ideas were a product of their time and their place. So what was this transition in thinking about economics that Smith and Hume gave us? If we go back to 1700, I think we can summarize the state of thinking about economics in quotation marks, because again, the word didn't even exist then, in three quick propositions. First, could individuals correctly perceive what was in their own self-interest in the economic sphere? And the general answer was no, probably not. And for that reason, it was deemed necessary to direct an economy from the top down. The English had all of their government-sponsored monopolies. The French had their mercantilist system. More centrally and more importantly, even if people could figure out what was in their self-interest to do in the economic sphere, there was no presumption, none whatsoever, that their acting on it would make anybody but themselves better off. And for that reason, acting in your own self-interest in the economic sphere was taken to be morally opprobrious. The standard noun applied to such behavior was vice. The standard adjective was vicious behavior. If we come forward to 1790, I picked 1790 simply because that's the year in which Adam Smith died, the presumptions are very different. First of all, can individuals correctly perceive their self-interest in the economic sphere? Smith's answer was mostly yes, when people act as producers of goods and services. Interestingly, Smith did not make the same assumption when people act as consumers. Much to the contrary, his writings are full of scathing comments about the foolish and frivolous decisions that people make, especially the rich, when they act as consumers. But he thought they got it right when they acted as producers. And he was a careful thinker. And so like a mathematician who doesn't want to assume anything stronger than what he needs to prove his theorem, that was enough for Smith. Second, Smith absolutely had what we call the first fundamental welfare theorem. What the Wealth of Nations is all about is showing how and why it's true that under the right conditions, which Smith identified as market competition, people acting on their own self-interest with no altruism involved will make others better off. And as a result, by the time we get to the Wealth of Nations, the whole vocabulary of vice and vicious is gone. Those words do occur in the book, but never to refer to merely acting on your own self-interest. Now, to be clear, Smith did have intellectual precursors. I've listed here a few of the more important ones, both in England and in France. France is important because Smith lived in France for 2.5 years when he was just setting out on this project. And so I think we have to address right up front the question of whether these precursors deserve the credit instead of Smith. Maybe people like me should think of Pierre Nicole as the founder of modern economics, or maybe Bernard Mandeville. My answer to this question is a resounding no. And the reason is that none of these people, important as they may have been, had any explanation for how this crucial result came about. They had no explicit awareness of the role in this process of competitively set wages and prices, or the role of markets. And we might say, okay, they didn't have our explanation, maybe they had a different one, but they didn't. And especially for a generation of intellectuals who had all been trained to think in terms of Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism, that just wasn't going to fly. Newton's great book, the Principia Mathematica, had been published in 1687. By the time Adam Smith was an undergraduate in the 1730s, the book was part of the standard curriculum at every Scottish university, also at Cambridge. Interestingly, not at Oxford. Maybe that's why Oxford lagged behind Cambridge in scientific endeavor for so long. But for this generation of intellectuals, it just wasn't going to work. So let's be explicit before we move on to the religious origins. Let's be explicit about what Smith's argument was in The Wealth of Nations. To begin, he took the desire for material gain as simply inborn in us and no more morally opprobrious than the fact that we have to breathe or the fact that we have to eat. It's just part of who we are. At the center of the book and the argument is the role of competitively set wages and prices. And if you go back and look at The Wealth of Nations, I understand that students don't really read the book these days, which is a pity. But if you look at the passages of which there are many on the wages and price settings, it's striking what Newtonian language Smith uses to describe this process. He could be describing planets being held in their orbits around the sun. Well, he's not. He's describing the setting of wages and prices and the way those forces set in place by the wages and prices move the economy to the right place. And third, he sees these wages and prices as set by nothing other than two-sided bargains in which the sellers, importantly, including the sellers of labor, are just trying to get the highest price they can, and the buyers are trying to get the lowest price they can. There's no altruism, no public spiritedness intentionally brought to bear on either side. And for this reason, Smith sees this process as an aspect of the Enlightenment principle of unforeseen and unintended consequences. And this is the process that we know as the invisible hand that leads our actions in the economic sphere, even though solely driven by self-interest, to be globally beneficial. It makes other people better off as well. It's interesting that we know this as the invisible hand, even though Smith didn't attach much importance to the phrase one way or the other. He only used it once in each of his books, but that's what we know. Here is a picture of the statue of Adam Smith that stands in the Market Square in Edinburgh, right across from where Smith's office was when he was a commissioner on the Board of Trade. The statue has lots of symbolism in it. I'll just point to one. If you look at the hands carefully, you'll notice that you can easily see, it's right there, the left hand. But if you look at Smith's right hand, it's occluded. And that is not an artifact of the angle from which I took the picture. That's part of the symbolism that the sculptor built into the statue. And because of the invisible hand process, Smith was famously opposed to impediments to market competition. But I want to leave you with an important fact. I think Smith has been very badly treated over the centuries by politically conservatives. Smith did not, repeat, did not regard the competitive market process as a some kind of hothouse, fragile flower that needed to be protected at all costs. Instead, what impressed Smith was how robust this process was. And as a result, he was very prepared to entertain and favor uh, policies that we would all recognize as interferences with the market process. I've listed a few here. Smith was in favor of progressive income taxes. He was in favor of luxury taxes. He thought that people who were driven around in luxury coaches, think equivalent people who drive Mercedeses and BMWs today, ought to pay a luxury tax on those vehicles. And he was very explicit that he wanted the revenue from those taxes to be used to alleviate poverty. He was in favor of taxes on whiskey and on distilleries. That's pretty bold for somebody who lived in Scotland. And he was in favor of much tighter regulation on banks than anything we've known in our lifetimes in the United States. So think of Smith as not some defender of a fragile process, but rather an enthusiast for its remarkable robustness. Now, the central question I take up in my new book is, what is it that enabled Smith and Hume and others to reach this remarkable insight? Well, I've already mentioned a few of the key elements in this. I've mentioned his training in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism. In terms of philosophy, he was well trained in Stoic philosophy that emphasizes natural harmony in the universe. And if you think about it a bit, the idea that when I do something that's in my self-interest, that makes you better off, there's an idea of harmony in the universe. Smith lived in what was becoming an increasingly commercial society. He lived in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, and in London, and he was a very observant man. And he was also, to repeat, a moral philosopher and a very insightful one. And so there's a lot of introspection in his two books as well. But I think that even all four of those together wasn't enough. And I think what enabled him and his contemporaries to reach these powerful insights was this new and hotly contended line of thinking in the religious thinking in the English-speaking Protestant world, which importantly was right at its height in Scotland when he was coming into young adulthood. The process of moving away from belief in predestinarian Calvinism was a kind of rolling phenomenon. It was at its height in England in the latter half of the 17th century. It was at its height in the early to mid decades of the 18th century when, to repeat, Smith and Hume were coming into adulthood and therefore forming their worldview, their pre-analytic vision. And interestingly, although that's another conversation, it was at its height in this country in the latter half of the 18th century, right when our forebears were founding the American Republic. And I think it was influential there too. Now, let me be explicit about what I have in mind in the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism. There were, of course, many elements involved in this new theological thinking, but for our purposes, I'm going to emphasize only three. One concerning human nature, one concerning human destiny, and one concerning the human purpose. In terms of human nature, Calvin famously preached that all individuals were born totally depraved, to continue quoting him, unable to distinguish good from evil, wholly unable to do good in the world. Why? Because of the sin of our ancestors in the Garden of Eden. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists believe that every individual is born with inherent goodness. To use John Locke's famous metaphor, Locke thought that we're all given the candle of the Lord, by which he meant reason, if we're only willing to take advantage of it. Well, thinking of us as all having the candle of the Lord, reason, instead of all being totally depraved, places a different flavor on our ability to make appropriate choices and take actions. Second, in terms of human destiny, for people who are concerned about their role in the afterlife, whether they're going to be over here in Memling's famous triptych of the justice, the day of judgment, or over here. Hank, when I teach about this at Harvard, I explain to my students that these are the people who got their problem sets in on time, and these are the people who are late. I leave it to you whether you want to do that at Dartmouth. Calvin taught that who is to be saved in the afterlife and who is to be condemned to eternal death and punishment is a choice made not only before the individual was born, but before the world was even created. And therefore, it followed that there was no role whatsoever for any causal force of any action or choice that the person might take. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists thought that everybody is potentially eligible to be saved. And moreover, that our choices that we take and the actions that we take matter. In the words of John Tillotson, who was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed after England's glorious revolution in 1688, we are each able to cooperate with the divine in achieving our salvation. And then finally, in terms of the human purpose, Calvin taught that the only reason we are here is for the glorification of God. Calvin's famous phrase is that the entire universe is a theater of God's glory. And therefore, why should matters be arranged in order to achieve human welfare? And by contrast, the post-Calvinists thought that at the very least, a reason we're here, and maybe the principal reason we're here, is that we should be able to achieve human happiness. And therefore, they thought it was not surprising that the world should be ordered, including human institutions, think markets, in order to enable us to achieve human happiness. Well, to repeat, this debate was absolutely at its height when Smith and Hume would have been forming their worldview. Now, I want to address clearly why it is that this religious debate, we were talking about theology here, why would this have mattered for the worldview or Schumpeterian vision of these men who clearly were not religiously committed individuals? I'm going to point to three reasons. First, they lived in a world in which religion was more important and more central and more multidimensional and more pervasive than anything we know in our time. All educational institutions in those days were religious foundations. Mine was, yours was. Who was Eleazar Wheelock? Wheelock was a distinguished Connecticut Valley divine. Who was John Harvard? That's who he was. Who was John Winthrop, who really founded my institution? So all educational institutions were religious in nature, but it was more than that. It was a matter of politics and patronage. In 1707, the Scots had given up their status as an independent country. There was no more Scottish Parliament at this time, but they had the Scottish Church. And the church was important for politics, for patronage. So religion was all over the place. Second, we've all heard of the Scottish Enlightenment as this marvelous intellectual climate. What I think most of us don't take on board is how integrated it was. Think first about university faculty and curriculum. Here's a picture of the University of Glasgow when Smith was a professor there and also an undergraduate there. Except for the chapel over here on the right, the whole thing was in one building. It was pretty small, and the faculty was small too. Here's a listing of all of the professorships on the Glasgow faculty when Smith was there. He was the professor of moral philosophy, but there was a professor of divinity, we would call it theology, and a professor of church history right in the same faculty. Well, at my university, we have theologians, we have church historians. They don't teach in my faculty. They don't teach undergraduates at all. They teach this thing about 3/4 of a mile away called the Harvard Divinity School. At Yale, it's even worse. The Yale Divinity School is more than a mile away. And moreover, it's located at the top of the steep hill. If you're going there from the old campus, the center of Yale, you really have to want to be there. So Smith existed and had faculty contacts and talked about curriculum issues, did his teaching right there with the theologians and the church historians. We've also all heard, I hope, about these profusion of intellectual societies, dining societies that Edinburgh and Glasgow had in the Scottish Enlightenment. The most distinguished one of them was called the Select Society. Here's a listing of the 31 original members of the Select Society. Smith and Hume, of course, were members. But right there, the second largest category behind the lawyers, and lawyers meant something different in those days, second largest category was 5 Church of Scotland ministers, including their great friend Robertson. And Robertson was a very interesting figure. I mentioned before that William Robertson was the head of the Church of Scotland. He was the moderator of the Church of Scotland General Assembly. But simultaneously, he was the principal, in our vocabulary, the president of the Church of Scotland, of the University of Edinburgh. So he was head of the church, he was head of the university. So it's as if the president of my university would be the president of Harvard and simultaneously the head of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Well, he isn't, but William Robertson was. And the third reason to which I will point is the extreme contentiousness of religion in the religious debate in those days. Religious questions were things that men fought and died over. The 30 Years' War on the continent just 100 years earlier between the Catholics and the Protestants had been more deadly compared to the size of Europe's population than either World War I or World War II turned out to be. The English Civil War, not between Catholics and Protestants, but over the question of what kind of Protestant were they going to be. English Civil War was more deadly compared to the size of England's population than World War I or World War II. And down through the years, even the Highland Rebellion, we read about the Highland Rebellion. We read about all these Sir Walter Scott novels, Waverley and Bonnie Prince Charlie and all that. And we think of the Highland Rebellion as this marvelously romantic episode through the eyes of Scott. Well, it was mighty bloody too. And some of the fighting took place right outside of Edinburgh. It was 1745. Smith was 22 years old. He could not possibly have failed to take notice. And then finally, let me remind everybody of what I've already talked about, namely this strong substantive coherence between the new economic ideas of people acting on their own self-interest under conditions of market competition and the new religious thinking that gave rise to, opened the way for a more expansive view of the possibilities for human choice and human agency. So my argument throughout the first half of the book is that what Adam Smith and David Hume and their contemporaries were doing was secularizing these new religious ideas of their time and their place, namely this more benign and optimistic view of the human character, a more expansive view of the possibilities for human agency. And they were doing that because this was part of the worldview, in Schumpeter's term, the vision of their time and their place. And I think this, in a way that I've traced out in the second half of the book, I think this religious impulse right at the outset, right on the ground floor of what became modern Western economics, has stayed with us ever since. Today, what do we teach in economics? It's all about the choices, the decisions, the actions made by individuals, by households, by firms. The first fundamental welfare theorem is still absolutely the heart of our analytical apparatus. And I think if you scratch any economist, you're going to get this more optimistic view of the human enterprise that comes from Smith and Hume. And what I do in the latter half of the book is to trace out the way in which, right down through the 19th and the 20th centuries, even as the economy was changing, and of course the questions that economists were asking were changing along with it, right down through this period, these religious resonances were still there as people debated things like the role of government, the nature of the economy. And I think they're still with us today, especially in our country's public debate over economic policy and in the voting behavior of ordinary Americans when they confront issues of economic policy. And so I'd like to close with a few words on this subject, bearing in mind, Hank, that this is the political economy project at Dartmouth, which I very much respect. A question that has attracted lots of attention, not only in the popular media, but also among the political science community, is why so many Americans seem to vote against their own economic self-interest. If we think about states like, for example, Mississippi or Kentucky, these are states in which the frequency with which people draw on programs like food stamps, supplemental income, public housing are much greater than in other places. And yet people tend to vote much more so than in other places for candidates parties, for Republicans who want to cut back on those programs. Well, is this a puzzle or not? The political science community has suggested an explanation based on two familiar features of American democracy. One is that we live in a representative, not a direct democracy. We don't vote for policies, we vote for candidates. And second, the candidates are put up by parties, and we have way too few parties to span the relevant space of policy choices. So I can illustrate the problem in just a two-dimensional space. Think about economic issues in which people can favor policies that favor high-income individuals. I put those on the right. Or they can favor policies that favor low-income individuals, families. I put those on the left. And they can have views on social issues. They can be socially conservative. I put that on the top. And they could be socially liberal. I put that on the bottom. Well, because we have only two political parties for all practical purposes, even with just two dimensions of choice, we don't have enough parties to span the space of choices. People who are in favor of policies that favor high-income families and who want socially conservative policies find a natural home in the Republican Party, fine. Those who want policies that favor low-income families and want to be socially liberal find a home in the Democratic Party, fine. But the political science community then focuses on this group up here. What about people who really are opposed to things like abortion and same-sex marriage, but they would benefit from food stamps and the other policies that favor low-income families? Where do they go? Well, the social science or the political science community argues that they are led to vote Republican because they care more about the abortion and the same-sex marriage than they do about the food stamps and the supplemental income. And it's important to realize this is not a trivial part of the American electorate. Here are the data on voting and preferences from the 2016 election. The red dots are the people who voted for Trump. The blue dots are people who voted for Clinton. And I've arranged the grid here in the same way I had before, so that social conservatives are on the top, social liberals are on the bottom, people who want policies favoring low-income groups are on the left, high-income groups are on the right. And according to these data, which I took from Lee Drutman, a familiar political scientist, this group that the political science community is focusing on is 29% of the American electorate. Well, that's a lot. You could say, why don't we focus on the people on the other side, have the other problem? Well, they're only 4% of the electorate, so we can skip over them. But this is a lot of people. Now, what I think is wrong with the the political science explanation is that at best it's seriously incomplete because it leaves no role for religious thinking. And I'll illustrate what I have in mind with only 2 survey questions and then 1 policy issue, and then I'll stop. First, here's a question asking Americans whether they want a bigger government providing more services or a smaller government with fewer services. I don't think anybody is going to be surprised to know that the public is pretty well divided on this. It turns out that the fraction that want a smaller government is 51%. Mainline Protestants are a little more so, not very much. But by the time we get to people who identify themselves as evangelical Protestants, now it's 2/3, 1/3. And by the time we get to people who identify their evangelical denominations as traditionalist, now we're more than 2/3, 1/3. Here's another one. This is asking people whether they agree or not with a statement that government aid to the poor does more harm than good because people can't get out of poverty until their basic needs are met. On this one, the public as a whole is exactly divided 50-50. Again, mainline Protestants are not very different. Evangelicals, we're getting close to 2/3, 1/3. And traditional evangelicals, we are at 2/3, 1/3. Well, that's really striking. There's nothing in the political science explanation I just articulated that would explain this phenomenon. And now I'll focus on one policy issue, namely opposition to estate taxation. This is asking whether people would like to abolish altogether the estate tax. In this graph, I'm showing the opposition to estate taxation in red, with a scale on the right. In this poll, the opposition was 44%. Today, it's about 48%. And on the left graph, a left scale in blue, I'm showing the average income for the group, which I've normalized at 100 for the US population. Well, to start off, there's no surprise among Republicans. We know Republicans have higher incomes than average Americans, and therefore it's no surprise they are more than average opposed to estate taxation. Democrats, no surprise, they're somewhat less than average income, less than average opposition to estate taxation. Mainline Protestants, again, no surprise, slightly higher than average incomes, slightly higher than average opposition to state taxation. The surprise is in the evangelicals. Evangelicals have much lower average incomes, even lower than the Democrats, but they don't have less opposition to estate taxation. They have in more. Where does that come from? The standard story from our political science colleagues cannot explain such patterns. And by contrast, I argue that the historical foundations of attitudes toward economic thinking that I outline in my new book can do so. So let me conclude. Yes, of course, economics was and it still is a product of the Enlightenment, but that does not mean that there was nothing about religious thinking that was involved. I think religious thinking was absolutely central to how and why Smith and his colleagues gave us what became Western economics. And I think especially in our country, and especially in our ongoing debate over public policy, those religious resonances are still there. So Hank, I finished what I had to say, and I'm very glad to take on questions or opposing points of view. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay, and I'll turn the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for a characteristically superb and lucid presentation. I'll just ask you, Ben, is a terrific talk. I wonder whether you do anything in your book with the physiocrats, who, of course, as you very well know, were contemporaries of Hume and Smith. Smith, of course, in his aforementioned time in France, met some of them. He almost dedicated the Wealth of Nations to
Kane.
Yes,
absolutely.
And of course, they had an economic theory that certainly placed a great deal of emphasis upon markets and sort of, I suppose you might say, the first welfare theorem. And yet, as you well know, they were Roman Catholics rather than Protestants. So I wonder whether you do anything with that in your book, and what would you say to that angle on the creation of political economy?
Well, to begin, you're absolutely right. When Smith was living in Paris, he got to know Kane and the other physiocrats, and as you rightly point out, he and Kane became very friendly. And Smith wrote that if Kane had still been living at the time the Wealth of Nations came out, he would have dedicated the book to him. So that says a lot. Kane, alas, died in 1774. The book came out 2 years later, so Smith couldn't do that. And Smith was clearly influenced by Kane. He says so. So why do I not give more credit to the physiocrats? I think there are two reasons. One, even though, as you correctly say, they understood about markets, I don't think the physiocrats had the notion of the competitive mechanism operating in markets to set prices in the way that Smith did. I mean, remember, the France in which they lived was this mercantilist society. Colbert had been in the previous century, but more recently, people like Turgot had been, well, Minister of Finance is, I guess, what we would call it, and Director General of the economy. So they lived in this top-down economy, and I just don't think the physiocrats saw it. The second reason I don't place much emphasis or enough emphasis on for that purpose on the physiocrats is that, as the name suggested, what the name physiocrats came from is that they thought the only real origin of wealth and living standard was agriculture. And Smith thought agriculture was important too. I mean, he wrote about the need to have an agricultural surplus so that not everybody needed to work on the farms. But for Smith, the interesting action was in commerce. And as I said, he lived in these commercial centers. He was a commissioner of the Board of Trade. And he thought the competition that's taking place among merchants is what was driving all this. The emphasis is on the merchants, not the producers of the grain. So that's why I don't give full credit to the physiocrats. Very interesting folks. They were important. Incidentally, there's a line of thought that points not to Canet, but to one of his long predecessors, Bois Guilbert. Gilbert Faccarello's book emphasizes Bois Guilbert, but I don't believe that either.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. Let's try again on Jim Murphy and see if we can get Jim's question. Jim, can you hear us? I'm sorry, we're still getting the same sort of static. If you wanted to use the chat function, Jim, we could try it that way. In the meantime, Ben, I'll ask you another question since you did such a bang-up job on the physiocrat question. One of the books that my students and I are reading this term is Tomas Sedlacek on the economics of good and evil. And he argues that, in fact, there are deeper and much longer gestating connections between religion and the emergence of political economy. He's got a very interesting chapter on the Israelites, the ancient Israelites. He's got a very interesting chapter on why it is that Christianity might have contributed to an economic way of thinking, modeling, and the idea of abstract laws and many ideas. I wonder whether you have anything to say about the Sedlacek book, and whether that too might have an effect on your thesis that it was these really interesting, and you're absolutely right, really important religious contests of the middle of the 18th century in Scotland that were the post-Destinarian move in particular of Scottish Calvinism that were the decisive factor.
Well, first, I'm not going to comment on the Sedlacek book because I haven't read it. So I know who he is, but I have not read his book. But as to the general point, going way back, yes, and I have some traces of this in my book as well, and looking at the origins. I mean, clearly all the way back to the Hebrew Bible. Judeo-Christian thought had a lot to say about self-interest, and also had some things to say about the economy and markets, but more from an ethical point of view. The people in the Hebrew Bible, I argue, had no concept of economic growth in the way that we know it. In effect, they lived in an economy that they thought of as what economists today would call a two-factor model. They understood about good harvests versus bad, and they understood about war versus peace. And they knew which was better in each case. And for that reason, the Hebrew Bible is absolutely full of prayers for peace, and it's full of prayers for rain and good harvests and all that stuff. But they didn't have any sense that they could get to a higher standard of living by organizing the economy differently, and therefore their focus is primarily about things like ethical behavior. Leviticus 19, when you have your farm, you don't mow the edges of the grain. You leave that for the poor. When you've got your grapes on the cart taking it to the market, If a bunch of grapes falls off of the back of the cart, you don't pick them up. You leave those for the poor. There are all these injunctions, and how you don't let the sun set before you pay your workers the day's wages. And this is all through the Mishnah and the Talmud as well. Now, the early Christian fathers had, if anything, a kind of negative view of this. The book I would point to, and maybe your students would want to read some chapters, Peter Brown from Princeton a few years ago had a marvelous book called Through the Eye of a Needle. Brown is best known for his biography of Augustine, and so not surprisingly, Augustine plays a major role in Brown's book. But he shows that they had very conflicted views about wealth. Augustine famously wrote that the lust for money was comparable to the lust for sexual activity and the lust for power over other men. And then you come right through up to during the Thomist period in the scholastics in the Middle Ages. So absolutely, people thought about these issues. I think they were impeded, to be honest, by the negative view of economic activity and the desire for gain that came from Augustine and right up through the Thomist period. They were interested not in the prices that were what we economists would call market clearing prices, or prices that were going to allocate economic activity in the right way. They were interested in the just price. And they knew pretty well, they knew what they meant by that. This was not a vague notion to them, but it's a different notion. So I think all these ideas are interesting, and I have some things to say about them in the book, but I do not think that's where modern Western economics came from.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. I'm going to read off to you the question that Jim Murphy has been struggling for the better part of 20 minutes now to get out. He says, Tawney, who I know that you know very well, since the title of your book is Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Richard Tawney, a British writer of the early 20th century, argued against Max Weber that capitalism transformed Protestantism nowhere more than in America. So the fact that American evangelical Protestants support capitalism today just reflects how much their religion has been shaped by capitalism. Nowhere is this transformation more obvious than with Mormonism. So it seems like Jim is suggesting, well, maybe the causal arrow runs in the opposite, in the other direction from the one that you've mainly been discussing. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, I do. Jim, thanks for the question, and apologies that couldn't hear you and you had to do it that way, because otherwise we could have engaged in some conversation. I'm very sympathetic to your point of view, as I'm guessing you well know. Economists in general tend to be very comfortable with notions of two-way causation, and I certainly am as well. There are some points in the book in which I talk about the causation running the other way, what we can call for shorthand the Tawney way. The historian on whom I draw in my book, and he does point directly at early 19th century America for this purpose, is Daniel Walker Howe. And Dan's argument is that in the same way that I'm portraying people as carrying over their non-predestinarian beliefs into the secular realm, people saying, well, if I'm capable by my choices and actions of affecting something as important to me as my ultimate spiritual destiny, surely I'm able to affect something like whether I get ahead in life and can make other people better off and so forth. Dan's hypothesis is that it went the other way also, and that people, and again, his setting is early 19th century America, where there's all of this extraordinary opportunity to get ahead that Tocqueville wrote about. Dan is picturing these people who clearly have enormous control over their economic prospects, sitting there in the pews on Sunday morning and just not paying any attention whatsoever if anybody tried to tell them that they couldn't affect their ultimate spiritual destiny. So Dan had that, and I believe it also, and also I'm an admirer of Tawney. I wouldn't have taken, I took my book's title from the set of lectures that Tawney gave in 1922 and then published into a book in 26. So I'm very sympathetic, but nonetheless, I chose to write my book about the causation in the other direction. And the reason is that, look, I'm an economist. I was trying to, I understand I'm not doing economics in this book, I'm doing intellectual history, but I'm an economist and I wanted to explore where my subject comes from. And therefore, I was looking for the origins, the roots of economic thinking. And therefore, I set out to look for a causal process in which the economic thinking was going to be at the end of the arrow, not the beginning of the arrow. But I'm very, very sympathetic to the notion of two-way causation. Incidentally, I dealt with that in my previous book as well. My book that Hank was kind enough to mention on the moral consequences of economic growth is mostly about how the experience of economic growth shapes the political, social, ultimately the moral character of a society. And one could well ask, well, doesn't the political, social, moral character of a society influence or have a bearing on its ability to achieve economic growth? And the answer is absolutely yes. And as I recall, I devoted a chapter or two in that book to this opposite causation mechanism. But in each case, I chose to write a book with emphasizing one arrow of causation, but it doesn't mean that I'm not open to the other one. For economists, mutual causation is just fine.
Thanks very much, Ben, for your answer to that question and for a really terrific presentation. We've reached the end of our time. Thank you for being with us this Wednesday, and very best of luck on this exceedingly interesting and timely book. Come up in person and visit us sometime. It's not that far from where you are.
Well, as you know, I have occasion to be in Hanover from time to time. It's always a delight, and I think going forward, I'm going to have even more occasion to be there, as you may be aware. And so that would be absolutely delightful. But for today, I'm honored and very pleased to have been with you. So thank you for the kind invitation. It's been great to be with you, and good luck to your program.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for your participation as well. We'll see you next Thursday for Alan McFarland. Thank you again. Bye-bye now.